I'm a Marine man from Bundaberg, central Queensland, waterman on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. As part of our protocol in Australia when dealing with cultural issues and when we go into other people's country, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Hawaii, the Hawaiian people, and to thank them for allowing me to come onto their country. Because I realise it's the Hawaiian land and always has been and always will be. The talk tonight is going to be a bit about Australia and Aboriginal people. I'm going to talk about museums, and then I'm going to talk about 4 or 5 projects. I was initially going to discuss one project, the Wonnarua, but I felt that there was so many interesting projects coming from different diverse organisations and Aboriginal people that just to give you a little snapshot of those would probably be better than to delve deeply into one. Okay. In 1996, the population of Australia, Aboriginal population was 386,000. The median age was 20 years, a very young population. Life expectancy, 57 for males, 62 for females. Indigenous population lower than the proportion of both Canada and New Zealand, who we compare ourselves with for a whole range of different reasons. Very urbanised. Sydney is the largest concentration of Aboriginal people anywhere in Australia. So Aboriginal people aren't living on the land, we're living in cities. And 13.3 speak Indigenous languages. Some 13.6 have post-school qualifications. Well, then you can see read those ones, so I won't go through them. Okay, Aboriginal history, where the oldest continuous GP. 60,000 years of occupation, Aboriginal people came down through the Indonesian archipelago. 40,000 years ago in Western New South Wales, Aboriginal people were living at Lake Mungo, and these are some of the oldest, these remains that were found at Lake Mungo in the late 70s, are some of the oldest fully formed Homo sapien remains in the world. All of Australia was occupied, including Tasmania 20,000 years ago. And the last ice age was 20,000 years ago. That's when Tasmania, the island south of Australia, was cut off from the mainland. The dingo was introduced 6,000 years ago, and the dingo then wiped out the Thylacine and the Tasmanian devil, which were on the mainland, and they survived until European colonisation in the 1900s. The dingo arrived 6,000 years ago. 1,500 years ago, 1,700 years ago, trepang fishermen were coming down from Makassar, Indonesian island. The trepang was then traded back into Imperial China. Aboriginal people were then in contact with the Dutch in the western parts of Australia. Captain Cook arrived, of course, in 1770, and all they said we want was us to be gone. It was a statement by one Aboriginal person. Captain Phillip arrives with the first fleet of convicts. Almost instantaneously, conflict starts happening. And certainly, as you can see from some of those dates, 1790, Hemingway undertook quite an extensive insurgency against Phillip in the western parts of Sydney. In 1868, 150 Aboriginal people were killed in a punitive action in the Kimberleys. 1870, the beginning of the Aboriginal children being taken away from their families, starting to breaking down the culture. Wonnarua in Western Australia declares war on Europeans. Federations, Aboriginals were not counted in the census. I'll just flick through some of those. It wasn't until '67 that Aboriginal people were counted in the census and were considered as full Australians. What happened from about the 1930s to the 70s, there was a huge amount of political agitation by Aboriginal people. A land rights movement was started. The first land grants happened in about 1973 or 75. that should be 1985, Uluru Ayers Rock was handed back to its traditional owners. The Black Deaths in custody, there was Aboriginal incarceration rates are huge. There was a huge percentage of those incarcerations. People were supposedly committing suicide. Royal Commission was put in place to try to stem this tide of death, and we brought it back in 88. The Redfern speech was a famous speech by our Prime Minister, Keating at the time, which talked about the dispossession, the poisoning of the water holes and those sorts of things. And it's really seen as a landmark speech and acknowledgement of the treatment of Aboriginal people. So that gives you some of the sense of the politics. I mean, Australia is, and Aboriginal issues in Australia are very political. There's great divides in how do we deal with the Aboriginal problem. But certainly the issue of culture, the continuation of culture, is a very significant part of Aboriginal self-esteem, but it's also a very important part of the native title getting land back process. What is a museum? Got the HMA here, so lots of people seem to know what museums are, and I think the traditional sense, my museum was a traditional museum. We had public programs, we had collections, we had research. We had science, Indigenous cultures felt within that, curators felt that the collections were theirs, and theirs alone. Why I'm going through this is because I think that the history is important to understand where we are at the moment, and I think that the little steps that the Australian Museum and museums in Australia have made over the last 30 years are built on a lot of these issues of political agitation by Aboriginal people and those sorts of things. Aboriginal people have always seen the museum as being part of the structure of dispossession. We were the places where we could say things about Aboriginal culture that was demeaning, that placed them within the human evolutionary cycle at the lowest end. These are the sorts of things that people saw there. We also, in our early days at the Australian Museum, this quote, "Moving the Phillip before they died," there was a huge rush around 1870 and 1880 to collect as many Aboriginal objects as possible because the race of Aboriginal people were going to die out within 20 years. We also portrayed this Darwinistic view of culture, and how and why we changed was obviously because of political agitation. But one of the major things, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on, why Aboriginal people felt museums were not places where they could be involved in was the fact that we collected human remains and studied human remains and ancestral remains and displayed ancestral remains. So out of the issue of repatriation and all those sorts of things, this new relationship started to evolve, which we're now working on in this new environment. Part of the coming together of the minds of museums realising that they had to change was setting up organisations within the museum, the Aboriginal Heritage Programs. One of the things that was seen hugely important by Aboriginal people as they were going to become partners with museums was the fact that it was staffed by Indigenous people. And our unit's mission was to assist Indigenous communities in gaining access to their cultural heritage, creating a skill base that allowed communities to manage their cultural heritage. This is classic museum outreach. We still do loan material to Aboriginal communities, assist them in setting up museums and all of those sorts of things. But the philosophy that underlines that classic outreach program can certainly be seen in the way that we deal with new technologies. And I think this is really important. We've had 30 years of experience of developing relationships with Indigenous people in the museum world in Australia. And many of the principles and philosophies, and I'll go through some of the profiles and those, are even more important now in the digital world. And the reason that is that in the old days, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, if an Aboriginal community wanted us to do something for them, we would go and visit them. And that one community, we'd consult, we'd chat, and we would undertake the project that people wanted. Now, because of the fact that Aboriginal people can be found not only on their country, but in other countries, the fact that we have to consult with different people about the digital realm and get their permission and their involvement complicates the factor dramatically. But it's based on the principle of consultation that we set up all those years ago. And it gets down to the fact that when you're dealing, even in the digital world, you are still dealing with people. You have to show respect and you have to show commitment. Consultation, and I mean, it's a phrase that in Australia is thrown around quite a lot. I've consulted with you, I asked you. And to my mind, and to my organisation's mind, consultation is more than that. We talk, we listen, and then we act. Process has to be developed to input this information. Thus, consultation equals evaluation, and it happens on a rolling basis. So we talk, we make sure we're clear on what people want, and then we deliver. And then when we deliver, we then evaluate that delivery to make sure that it really was what people wanted. And I think that sort of a process is even more important, as I keep stressing this, in the digital realm. And there's a whole range of other protocols that then have to come into place when you're doing consultation. It has to be undertaken in a place acceptable to Aboriginal people. There has to be something in it for them. Ownership and ability to direct, long-term commitment, tangible results, Indigenous people involved. And I think the thing is that long-term commitment, and it has to be something in there for them, is a very important protocol, because how many times have people come into Aboriginal communities and promised the world and it's been there for a week and then you never see them again? I mean, and that's, in the digital world we can have a presence over a very long period of time, but we still need to have something in it for them. I'll talk about 4 projects, and then I'll talk about 4 or 5 different digital projects, because I think that, as I say, underlining this new world that we have, there's a lot of work that's gone on, a lot of trust that's been built, and I think the word trust is an important aspect there that needs to be gone through. The Youth Access Project. We sat down one day and we tried to work out how come we don't get many visitations from Aboriginal people at the front of the house, at the front of the building. They all come in the back, basically to look at the collection. But how can we actually get Indigenous youth to use the collection over the museum and to feel part of it? And as you can see, the methodology that we undertook was focus groups and so forth and so forth. And what they wanted was respect for them as people, Indigenous youth, welcoming atmosphere, seeing themselves reflected in content programming and staffing and active learning experiences, involvement in program development, use of technology. So when we did this research, we said, well, we can do all those other things, but the use of technology is probably the one that we're really going to get people in. Outreach programs, these were the bedrock of the involvement of the Australian Museum within Aboriginal communities. We basically started off with basic museum practices. The program was refined through workshop evaluation, long history of consultation. People knew they would be listened to when we were involved there. And basically what we were doing was assisting people setting up museums in their own areas. Because there was a perception in the late 80s, early 90s that for people to maintain their cultural identity and those sorts of things, museums would be a good source, local museums would be a good way of doing that. It's gone out of favour now, and I think what's happened is that the museum complex that people wanted to develop were real burdens upon the community, and now people are seeing that technology is a way of achieving those sorts of ends. So the Keeping Cultural CD-ROM, our first foray into a sustainable delivery of services to Aboriginal people was the development of the DVD. And basically there's a lot of talking heads, Aboriginal people talking to other Aboriginal people about setting up museums, why it's important, how you can go about it, how you can fund it, and those sorts of things. There was a lot of feedback came into the museum about that process, and we felt it was very successful. But it was just a tool. That it wasn't something that we could give to Aboriginal people and say, well, go away now, you don't need us anymore. We found that it was a way of presenting the information to Aboriginal people in a format that they wanted, but they still wanted you there. And the same thing that was used in Vancouver and a couple of other places, and people found exactly the same example. So it wasn't a standalone thing that I could send in the post. So then we've got the idea of how could technology how can we use new technologies to support Aboriginal cultural objectives. What we call it is digital repatriation, for want of a better word. But what is repatriation? And I think the thing is that it's not just what we've found during the process of repatriation, ancestral remains and cultural property, and intellectual property now, as we're doing through the web, is that it's about relationships. It's not about the objects. It's a two-way process about understanding commitment and return of remains and what have you. So you can take those first three principles and you can see where we're coming from when we start developing these other projects. Aboriginal perspective, and it's really interesting here, the return of remains and secret sacred, obviously, the return of other cultural property, intellectual material, training, and support of their cultural activities, objectives. So they saw repatriation as important, the top two, but the bottom three as being just as supportive. So we're starting to see people starting to work out how can we extend the idea of repatriation. And what is the repatriation process has made from the Australian Museum? We've developed relationships, knowledge flows back into the museum, staff development, and this really important thing, relevant organisation in the late 20th and early 21st century. And I think that people in Australia certainly understand the concept that if we were not repatriating, certainly if we weren't moving into digital repatriation in its many forms, then we would not be relevant to our major stakeholder, which is Aboriginal people. Digital repatriation, and I think one of the things about museums is we went through the land of plenty in the 1990s. There was a lot of money for Aboriginal issues in Australia. We saw the writing on the wall, and by 2000, I think this is why museums were scrambling to try to work out how we were going to deliver services to Aboriginal people. And we saw new technologies as being sustainable. And what reinforced it in my mind, Google Maps, I was in Central Australia about 2004, 2005, and I was listening to these people talk about these old Aboriginal men. And if you know Goddard from Central Australia, it's in three dimensions, basically. And these men were going on to Google Maps and looking at their country and then arguing over, now that's that property there, and they were using their technology to reinforce their cultural knowledge and to show to the young kids their cultural knowledge. And it really dawned on me then, here is a way that we can sustain our outreach programs and be relevant to Aboriginal people in the future. This is a really interesting project. I've jumped into the projects now. This is our editor, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier. This is a project based in South Australia. It's a community project, and it's a database, and it's been operating for 10 years. The Pitjantjatjara people are the people in the centre bit of Australia. Very diverse communities, very spread out, very inhospitable countryside. They said back 10 years ago, that they wanted the old photos from the missions brought back. This fellow down in South Australia started digitising. It then grew and grew and grew. And the community controls the process. So what normally happens, he digitises a whole range of material, and then every 6 months he does a 3,000 or 4,000 kilometre run around the various communities. He then uploads the material to their laptops. People then get onto their laptops and make alterations. They add data to the photographs, the films, or whatever. And then 6 months later he comes back and he downloads it. He takes it back. He puts it onto the system. So there's this constant cycle going on around there. The really interesting thing about this is that Aboriginal people don't want to know about the technology. They just know what they want out of the technology. And so this man goes and discusses it and consults it with the community about where this software will go. One of the and so part of the digitisation of the photos has been so wonderful in that people are seeing themselves as young people. There was a really wonderful little photo of 3 old men sitting around a campfire, and their hats are on and the whole works. And there was one elbow. They could only see one elbow. They could take this digitised photo back, and the old fellas sort of sat around and they looked at it and looked at they said, oh, that'd be Joe, Jim, that'd be Jim, that'd be him. And the consultant said, well, how do you know that? You can't see his face. Those three men were always together with one other man, and that'd be his arm. So just out of that one little bit, there was this whole history of their relationship that was developed, that was documented, and so forth and so forth. One of the really interesting things, and this it sent a bit of a shiver up my spine when we were talking about it. In Aboriginal Australia, in parts of Aboriginal Australia, secret sacred objects are that. They're secret and they're sacred, and people are still being speared in Australia for misuse of that material. Now, these old men in Pitjantjatjara land, you know, maybe only went to first class or second class, they were worried about this secret sacred material going on that they sort of understood service, you know, they understood. And they said, but that's women's stuff on that server too. And he said, yeah, but they can't access it, there's firewalls. And they said, no, we want our secret material put on another server. He said, even in the digital realm, that material can't be near where women's material is. So it's interesting, a cultural concept was them being transferred to the digital realm. And this chap works with this constantly, and he's just constantly amazed at the ability of people to transmit that sort of material. The future, it's one of the most exciting projects. It's been going 10 years. It's run on a really the smell and oily rag, as they say in Australia. I mean, they scrape money together and what have you. But I think it has a future because there's a whole generation of younger Aboriginal Pitjantjatjara people that are coming through. Now, for cultural reasons, they may never be able to take on the digitisation and those sorts of roles, but they understand technology and want to use the technology. And I've got a little example a little bit later on of how people are continuing to use technology, or going to use technology to continue our cultural practice. So that's a really interesting one. This is the other end of the scale. This is the Queensland Government project, and it's called the Knowledge Centres, which it's a really lovely name. And basically, it's a digitisation program. People can input material, but it's run at the local council level, and it's dispersed over. You can't really see that. Most of Queensland now. Queensland is probably 4,000 kilometres long and about a kilometre and a half, 1,000, maybe 2,000 kilometres wide, something like that. So it's a huge space, and the Queensland Government decided that they were going to digitise Indigenous material and get them back out there into the communities. The trouble with these sorts of programs, and being in a library, it's more likely to be sustainable than being in a museum because of the philosophical concepts that librarians work under, is that giving out knowledge is what they do. Governments come and go. It's a very expensive exercise. Local governments are involved, and like everywhere else in the world, Queensland local government's been squeezed financially. So what will happen is that as the budgets get tighter and tighter and tighter, they'll be moved. They'll be moved over, and maybe fall off the wall. So that's a real problem there with that one project. And as I say, I think there's a real question about sustainability. And governments love to move on to new projects, larger projects, and what have you. And I think that the idea of a local project has more legs. Yirrkala's in Arnhem Land. Yirrkala was visited during the 1948 Arnhem Land expedition. It was a joint Australian and Smithsonian Institute expedition just after the war. In fact, the Smithsonian has just repatriated the ancestral remains, some of the ancestral remains that were collected on that project. These people, in Aboriginal Australia, there are communities that are very powerful, very self-assured of their own cultural and of their own being, of where they come from. And these people are exactly that. So this documentation program is actually based in the community. They run it themselves. They have white people to run it for them because that's what they want. Because they don't want to know about the tech stuff. We've got you to do that. You go and do that, and we'll go and do ceremony and all those sorts of other things. So it's a really interesting concept. But it's theirs. It's run by them. There's oral histories, documentation, the whole lot. one of the really interesting things came out of this project was that a major significant Aboriginal artist called Wonnarua passed away in the mid-80s. But he did some oral histories on bark paintings at the Australian Museum and documented them and said what they were about, who was, what was the underlying message in it and all those sorts of things. We returned those tapes and copies of those photographs to the community, and one of the ladies up there were running a traditional health camp, and they came across the photo of this bark painting, which said that this tree was a medicine tree, and they didn't know that. So they went back into the centre and listened to Wonjik's tapes and realised that there was knowledge there that somehow had just passed away. And so it reinforced in their mind the value of obviously the digitisation. But the first question they asked was, how much more information is out there that we don't know about? So it was a classic example of digitisation achieving what we hoped, sustaining culture, but also increasing culture. And constantly that's the refrain by Aboriginal people. How much is out there that we don't know? How many oral histories? How many voices? How many language tapes do you have so that we can bring them back and record them? This one has legs. This community will not fold, obviously, but the enthusiasm for the project within the community. Young filmmakers have been down to the museum and they did a filmmaking course, and this is the beauty of digital cameras and that. Then came into the museum and filmed the Irukala collections in the museum, and were talking about them and in language, so that they could take it back to their old fellas and show them what was still being kept at the museum. And I have no doubt we'll be receiving a request for return of objects in the near future. Classic museum work, returning the object, but being done in a new forum. This is an interesting project too. This is the National Museum of Australia's Canning Stock Group exhibition. And it was driven by gallery development. Okay, so they wanted to put on this exhibition about the Canning Stock Group. They took a whole group of Aboriginal artists out into the country. The Canning Stock Group's right up the tip of the Kimberleys in Western Australia. So there was your classic museum, there was a collection developed, there was public programs developed, but what was in it for Aboriginal people, other than the sale of their objects and the sale of their artworks? The museum decided that there should be a digital record made of the whole project, of people's views, but also training should be given to Indigenous people, Aboriginal people up there, and the digital material should then be stored in the various communities that line the Canning Stock Group and so forth. But it was very expensive, and any of these sorts of projects, when you start flying teams of people into the middle of the Great Sandy Desert, I think you're looking at say $1,500 to $2,000 a week to support somebody in there. So it's a huge expensive exercise, but a very, very interesting example of what can and can't be done. This is a really interesting example. The community I can't mention there's a whole range of reasons. But somebody said, well, why don't we use iPads? All the kids are jumping around, they've got their iPhones and iPads. And what they decided to do was to download cultural material on the iPads that related to sites. Obviously not sensitive stuff. And said to the kids, you know where the sites are, go out and have a look at them, and have a look at the data that's about that site and what have you. So it was using new technology to reinforce old cultural norms. And it'll be really interesting to see how it works, whether it continues or whether people then find out new ways of doing it. But it's just a nice little snapshot of Aboriginal people thinking outside the box about technology and to reinforce their own cultural norms and cultural practices. And now the Wonnarua project, which was one of the highlights of the supposed presentation. Okay, the initial request, and I think this is where museums, this is our niche. This is where we can add value to Aboriginal people in the pursuit of their own cultural objectives. But the initial request came through in a classic request from an Aboriginal community. We know you have a significant collection of cultural objects. We want them brought back. We want to set up our own keeping place. This is in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales. Huge coal mining. I think Newcastle Port is, if it's not the largest coal export port in the world, it's pretty close. coal mining companies were going to support the setting up of a museum, keep in place to, to make them feel better that they were helping Aboriginal people as they ripped their country apart. So I went up to talk to people about that. And it was obviously the community was not 100% behind the cultural sector. And I said to this chap, Laurie Perry, I said, well, I've seen these things happen before. There's always a bucket of money to set up something, but it's the ongoing money that's a real problem. But it's also, if your community's not really behind it, you know what's going to happen. And Laurie's obviously understands these sorts of things. He said, but we want the collections up here, and there's no facilities there at that stage. And I said, well, how can we actually get community support? And I said, well, how about we develop a website and we look at intergenerational communication, and we do some workshops with Aboriginal people, kids, so they can go back and talk to their elders, and then record the information on, back on the website as a way of generating knowledge about the collection, but also to try and generate some enthusiasm. So we ran 2 workshops within the high schools on the website. So you can find the website on the Australian Museum site. You go to cultures, you go to Indigenous collections from the Hunter Valley. We ran these workshops with the kids, all enthusiastic, went back and started talking to parents. We then got a phone call from the high school. They wanted us to come and do it for the teachers. So there's about 160, 170 teachers there. It hasn't created a huge amount of information. And I've got to tell you, this site is not flash. It's a classic, it's nice and clean and all those sorts of things. Photographs, text messages, Laurie Perry's films on there, but it's generated a huge amount of interest and excitement within the community. And what's happening is that NAIDOC Week, which is the National Aboriginal Day of Commemoration, it's an Aboriginal holiday in Australia. Next year, they want to bring the collection, they're going to twist the arms of the mining companies to bring the collection back for that period of time, maybe a month, so they can generate more and more enthusiasm. So it's a nice round circle, if you can see what I mean. We started off with the classic museum outreach activity, loaning objects to Aboriginal people. We then went into new technology, which then generated enthusiasm to bring those objects back. So I think that these sorts of websites, these sorts of developments are the way that museums can provide sustainable support to Aboriginal people. The future is a very interesting one. They got so enthusiastic about this that they wanted us to then look at documenting people in the landscape and language within the landscape. And they wanted to download it onto their website, but also onto the Australian Museum's website. So we're in the process of seeking funding for that. And I think that this is the beauty of these sorts of tangible results that people can get very quickly, that meet their objectives, that then trust is built up, and then we go on to the next projects. We can then build upon their capabilities. It's a repatriation of ancestral remains in the Wonnarua River. Why are we doing it? We have the technologies, yes. I mean, my problem with some of the websites that we see, some of them that are being developed, they all seem to start off with, we're developing this for the Indigenous people. And they'll like us for it. And, they understand. When you step back and you think, well, you've got the technology and that's why you want to do it. Or you want to do it for a different audience and you're using the Indigenous concerns as a mask. And one suspects that that one is probably more close to the norm than others. Can't stress consultation is important. In this day and age, we can't afford to waste time and resources and money. And if you're developing anything without people giving you clear directions and supporting you fully, then you're going to waste all of the above. And I've been in the game long enough to know that I don't like to raise expectations of Aboriginal people. And so if I say I'm going to deliver something, I try to deliver it. I mean, sometimes but those consultations are important. And they're made even more important, as I said earlier, because of the reach of the net. Because it will go to every Wonnarua person in Australia, whether they're in Perth, Adelaide or Hobart. So we actually have to make sure that we really have crossed out T's and dotted the I. Community-driven projects are more likely to be successful, and I think through the talk I've tried to emphasise that. I think that even in the traditional museums, Aboriginal museum network system, where governments would fund these lovely buildings in the middle of nowhere and have consultants come in and say, well, yeah, of course it's going to be sustainable, there's tourists here, but there's all these sorts of things. If the community didn't support them, they failed within a couple of years for a whole range of different reasons. And I think this is the same. We will see hundreds of thousands of dead websites over the next 10 years. Websites that people don't use. The resources, limited resources went into developing it because we had the technology, or we thought that that's what they wanted. And I think that's important. The issues of sustainability. I think that the Pitchin Java Intergenerational project is a huge project that's been driven by the community. Now, and I know already that the person that's been running that is already talking about how can you make that sustainable when he is no longer there. And these are real problems. If you build these huge databases that aren't in a platform in a cultural organisation, for instance, or a sustainable cultural organisation where it's going to be funded for a long period of time, that's a real problem as well. But also, it's on the other side of the coin, the Wonnarua project, which was done fairly cheaply, is sustainable in many respects because we can probably do 2 or 3 of those projects a year and meet the requirements of Aboriginal people for not very much money. And I think the last one, and as you can see from my background, my writings and what have you, it's all about Indigenous control. And if it isn't, then I don't know why we're doing it. And I think that we shouldn't be doing it. And I think it's unsustainable. And it will make somebody feel good and warm for a period of time. But won't achieve anything other than we have another website. We've got, I forget what the text called it, we've got 10,000 pages up on the screen, aren't we? Good, we've got a bigger website than your website. And it's still all about the people and it's about information and relationships. I think the futures are very important for us as a classic museum person. I think that these new technologies will push us further and faster into some really interesting questions that we may have been able to not be involved in for quite a while. And the reason I say that is custodianship. The issue of who owns those collections. Now, and what sort of relationship should you have with the originating community. And I think that these sorts of things, museum memorandum of understandings will have to be developed because as people see material in their digital form in Eurocard, they may say, we want that specific object back now, and we want it back in 6 months. And where's the infrastructure to deal with those sorts of things? Or we want all of those women's material brought back now. And these are the sorts of requests that I'm expecting will happen. But also, people will say, you can have that object. You can have the dirty job of looking after those objects for us and putting all your resources into, but we want to own them. We want to stipulate how you will use them, and we want to go into an agreement with you. And I can see those sorts of things happening more and more in the future, and I think museums have to be more aware of them. We're already in those sorts of areas where we're dealing with ancestral remains, but also and material of secret and sacred nature. But increasingly, I can see, because people have access to knowledge, and they will want more than just, oh yeah, we're looking after it for you. They will want something in paper or agreements. It's all starting to happen with communities in Narrandjeri who have overarching agreements with the South Australian Museum on how their material will be housed, who can look at it, who can research it, and those sorts of things. I think the question of the iPad, I mean, who would have thought of that one? And I think that the ones, as people start to, as Indigenous people start to use it, Google Maps, for instance, we will see new ways of using it that are beyond the realms of what museum people would have thought. That there's an object, there's the data. What more do you want? And I think we'll see. There's an interesting project which we're looking at using Google Maps and secret sacred objects and placing the objects within the land. So people are looking at the land, and because objects are related back into the land, and can then bring the object up, and we're going to trial it in a bit next. And I keep stressing relationships. The museum's been there nearly 180, 190 years. Hopefully we'll be there another 180, 190 years, and we're not just about to retire. But the relationships that will grow with communities such as Yirrkala and Wonnarua. The Yirrkala is such a strong, as I said to you earlier, strong, passionate community and group of people that I can see that as we start to talk about memorandums of understanding, we'll be talking about renewing them every 5 to 10 years. There'll be a whole relationship that will be developed that will be way beyond classical museum teaching. And the last one, I think that all of the activities of museums over the last 30 years in Australia about relating to Aboriginal people's concerns about whether they be ancestral remains, secret, sacred, and all those other things, has made us relevant to them. And I think that new technologies will just give us the ability to raise that relevance level in supporting Indigenous people and their cultural areas. And I think that's about it. I hope that you've enjoyed that. But I think the point I'm trying to say is that even though we're 5-6 years into to doing this sort of stuff at the museum, I think the next 5 to 10 years is going to be really exciting because we will be going into such new ground and in working in partnership with people, which will be really exciting about to see what the results will get. Thank you. So is that from the State Museum or the Community Museum? Okay. I mean, what I was trying to say is that Aboriginal people have always been very adept at using, seeing where they wish to go and how they wish to get there. Now, and using people at appropriate spots. So you might have a director of a museum. They will just say to them, we really don't care about the technology and how it's done. We want you to do X course. And so it's really taking control of the project and of a process. And that person, certainly in places like Yirrkala, you would never be able to overstep the line. You would be told very quickly by the traditional owners that that was an owner and don't do it again or you're out. So it's about a community deciding what is important for itself. A good example is the Kitchen Yard or the Heritage Project. And what happens, because that chap, John, has been there for so long, the community members trust him, the senior men trust him. And he actually labours the point quite often. He says, when there's a really sticky situation, he goes back to them again and asks them, and what they say to him, John, we've already told you, no way, do it. We trust you. But he says, he still occasionally has to emphasise the point, especially when you're dealing with these objects of secret and sacred nature. So there's the trust issue. It's already there.
Would really help also here in Hawaii, just keeping people connected to a living, that it's a living, viable culture. It's not something just in a glass box somewhere.
I mean, museums, in the whole spectrum of cultural objectives, for one of them, but the cultural sphere of Aboriginal people, goes from land rights right through to health and medical things. Museums only sit that much. What we can do is really that much. And I think while these things are important and that they add to the overall, I think that museums have got to remember that that's all we are. And that's what we find. When we get people down from up north, the first thing they'll have a look at the objects and go, oh, that's nice. So we don't do it like that anymore. But anyway, and they say, where's your oral histories? Where's your language tapes? Where's your photos? These are the sorts of things that communities, and that's why new technologies are wonderful for that. And then as people leave the stories, they say, oh, well, when you send that one back to us, So, objects in those sorts of communities are as important as objects down the southeast are for a whole range of colonial reasons. And so we did find that the outreach program of loaning material was significant in certain communities and not so in other ones. We recently had a case in Wonnarua where the loan was, after 5 years, the material should come back. And I went up there to talk to the lady, and I was basically run out of town and told them not to come back until they had a better attitude. You know? And basically what the better attitude was, the material staying here. You know? So I think, yeah, I think there's a role to play for objects, but I think there's these other areas should never be forgotten. When you return, do you return objects so that people can undertake ceremonies, or is it to replace objects that they don't have anymore, and so forth and so forth. There's a whole range of things. I mean, you can return, there's repatriation, and then there's long-term loan and support. The issue of repatriation usually only involves sacred objects, or objects of significance, huge significance. Sacred objects, literally people are still being injured and hurt and killed if they misuse these objects. They're powerful objects. They've been taken out of the system where they were pivotal in many respects, and now you're asking the community to take them back in. Whole power relationships have changed within the community relating to objects. So if you take it back, you've got to make sure, one, you take it back to the right person, and two, they want it back. So in many cases, people will say, we don't want it back because it's too powerful, we don't understand how it held it out. But the objects that do go back are used then within the ceremony fairly quickly. The issue of long-term loans, that can vary from people just want access to cultural property because there's no cultural property left in their communities. Or they want the old cultural property. So just to show young people how it was done and those sorts of things. And there's a big issue in parts of Australia about people using their own cultural icons on their art. Like that. And so objects are quite often used in that context, taking it to the young artists and saying, these are your icons, these are your cultural designs that you can use. Don't use the centre material from the centre or material from up north. So there's a whole range of those sorts of activities. And I think that the more you go into it, the more you find out how people are using it differently. And I think that that's an important thing too. The question was about how the museum industry is accepting of this new technology that appears to be taking power away from them. I suspect there's parts of the museum world, you know, the curator would love to have his white coat or her white coat on, sitting down there with her objects or his objects, and not allowing any Aboriginal person to come near them. But I think because that's why the history was an important aspect, why I included that history, is that the relationship, the understanding, the two-way dialogue that's been going on over the last 30 years, this is just an exciting new way of doing it. And I think that that's the way people are embracing the digitisation of new technology. How can we get this out there fast enough, and how can we actually get people accessing this? And what it does, it seems to take the average local museum keeping place model and exploding it and saying to people, the reason you wanted this, we can do here. It's quite interesting, like the Wonnarua. They said, oh, that's wonderful, we love it, it's great, but we still want the objects back. So yeah, no, I think we feel that it's empowering, because our relationships are getting stronger. We're actually doing important things with the collections. And I think that if you museology over the last 20 or 30 years in Australia is about the use of the collections in a positive sense to support our Aboriginal activities, cultural activities. And I think it's an empowering thing. I think people want to do it. Especially when you see little films like that Laurie Perry film, digital camera, on the Mac did the editing, and it's up there on the web, and people can relate to it straight away. And in his words, he's telling it quicker and more succinctly than I can. So I think we find that the digital recordings of people coming into our storerooms, for instance, and talking to them about their relationship to objects, it's really powerful. So the anthropologist, the keeper of the gate, is not there anymore, and I think that's a very interesting component to the whole lot. As museums seen as being active agents in supporting Aboriginal land rights and those sorts of things. I think people actually think about museums that might. I don't think people think about museums much, to tell you the truth. I mean, in the general world. And if they want to come and they want to have a look at, you know, galleries and walk away, and that's, we haven't talked about that other component of the general public. But certainly with Aboriginal people, I think Aboriginal people would be surprised if museums went against their wishes anymore. I think that, you know, the relationship has moved on, that it's almost they expect us to be standing beside them when they want to deal with something on cultural issues. So I'm not too sure that, but the general public would never think of museums in any context other than dusty shelves and, you know, little old fogey curators running around the back. And there's no such thing as that.
But how